guest that I want to welcome is Professor Casper van den Berg. And Casper van den Berg is currently president of the Universities of the Netherlands since June 2024. Before assuming this role, he was dean and professor of the public administration at the University of Groningen. Between January 22 and September 24, he was a member of the Dutch Senate for the Liberal Party. In 2021, alongside his position in Groningen, he was also appointed endowed professor of transitions in the public sector at Leiden University. Van den Berg studied at University College Utrecht, my alma mater, and earned a master's degree from the London School of Economics and completed his PhD at Leiden University. His talk bears the title Academic Freedom and Public Trust in Times of Pressures. And he will focus on the question how and what can be expected of universities with regards to ownership in current academic challenges. What can and should universities do when facing political interference in contexts of self-regulation as we face in the Netherlands? Again, Professor Casper van den Berg, I'm so happy that you have agreed to speak to us today, and I would say the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be in your company this morning and share some of my thoughts on this topic. And I want to start by looking at what day it is today, because today, 92 years ago, Albert Einstein arrived in the United States after fleeing Nazi Germany. He was one of many scientists who left Germany and continued their research on the other side of the Atlantic, not because German universities had suddenly fallen short of research quality, but because they no longer succeeded in protecting colleagues who had been branded scapegoats by the politics of the time. And in Einstein's footsteps, as we all know, thousands of European scientists moved to the United States in the following decades. The open attitude of the United States, combined with strong public investment, enabled the country to become the world's leading scientific nation. The contrast with the situation today could hardly be greater. Scientists, students, and university administrators in the US now face political, legal, and financial pressure that is taking a toll on the free pursuit of science. Another example of political interference in science comes from the Soviet Union. The infamous case of Trofim Lysenko and his false version of evolutionary theory shows what happens when political ideology dictates science. Stalin made Lysenko's pseudo-scientific agricultural theories mandatory, and scientists who contradicted him were imprisoned or executed. The result was disastrous: crop failures and famines that claimed millions of lives. Or, closer to our time, look at Hungary, where free science has been all but eradicated in recent years. The Central European University was forced out of Budapest in 2019. So, are we indeed living in the dystopia that Aldous Huxley described, which is also the theme of today? And the question imposes itself, can we be sure that such things will never happen in the Netherlands? And if you ask me, the honest answer is no. Even here, scientists are currently facing questions they never had to ask before, about the continuation of approved research funding, about which words they may safely use, or about whether to self-censor before attending a conference in the United States. We've also seen examples of political interference and backlash towards universities, both from Parliament and from the Cabinet in our own country. In the summer of 2024, for instance, the PVV's education spokesman claimed that universities were captured by woke ideology and that cutting €1 billion would be helpful to make them rethink their priorities. The rhetoric was strikingly similar to that of surrounding the financial sanctions imposed on Princeton University, Harvard, and Columbia. A brave new world indeed. And it's not even limited to the PVV. The BBB, too, has tried to influence how university boards respond to demonstrations against the violence in the Middle East. And let there be no misunderstanding. Universities are no place for verbal or physical violence, no place for intimidation, no place for vandalism or defacement. We condemn such acts outright. Unfortunately, last week, we saw again protesters cross a new line in Nijmegen, endangering themselves, endangering university staff, police officers, and other first responders. These are serious offenses that have nothing to do with academic freedom. But still, none of this changes the fact that universities must remain places where robust debate and peaceful protests are possible, and where politicians should respect institutional autonomy. And that precisely is where things are beginning to go wrong. Take, for example, a recent parliamentary motion to cut off funding to organizations that boycott Israel. Universities were not mentioned explicitly, but in practice, the BBB was calling for subsidies to be withdrawn from institutions, including universities, that followed advice from a committee of sensitive collaborations deemed undesirable. And in April of this year, the VVD parliamentary faction urged the minister to admonish university supervisory boards over their safety policies, arguing that because the minister appoints these boards, at least in public universities, he could intervene. Now, even former Minister Bruins warned against such tendencies. Reflecting on developments in both the US and the Netherlands, he said, and I quote Eppo Bruins, "I want the minister to have less power after my term, not more. I want less political influence on science policies. Politics should have no say in that. The person in my chair doesn't wield the power of an American president, but you do have to remember that one day someone very different might sit in it." End of quote. Universities often defend themselves by invoking academic freedom. And at its core, that is right. Academic freedom is one of the university's very foundations. Without it, it becomes much harder to exchange new ideas or challenge existing paradigms. It is no coincidence that autocrats usually have little patience for such freedom. You shouldn't train your citizens too well in questioning, let alone overturning dogma. And history shows that countries with strong academic freedom are also far more successful in building and maintaining their prosperity and their international standing. Think of the Dutch universities in the 17th century. Leiden, Utrecht, Groningen, and Franeker were places of radical openness to debate. They cultivated homegrown talent, Van Leeuwenhoek, Huygens, Grotius, and thanks to the tolerance here that was lacking elsewhere in Catholic Europe, they also attracted the sharpest minds from abroad. Think of Descartes, think of Spinoza, think of Locke. These universities were intellectual engines of progress, contributing to advances in science, law, trade, and religious debate. But let's also take a step back. What exactly makes that freedom academic? It is not merely a way to keep outsiders off our campuses or to shield ourselves from political interference. It is the freedom to research, to teach, and to publish without external intervention, provided that it's done according to the standards of research integrity, of careful and verifiable science. In fact, academic freedom is more a duty than a right. It demands a higher level of accountability than ordinary expression. Scientists must substantiate their claims, must test them, and be continuously open themselves to critique. And that is something very different from freely expressing your opinion, for instance, at a talk show table. And that's precisely where things go wrong. Things often go wrong in our current polarized times. Academic freedom is increasingly misunderstood or even misused, as if it means that everything must be sayable, even when it is intimidating or careless, or as if renaming Christian holidays by a University of Applied Sciences has anything to do with academic freedom, as was suggested a few weeks ago in Parliament. You can certainly have a debate on those issues, but don't call them science, don't call them academic, because it waters down or it pollutes the very idea of academic freedom. So we must remain vigilant in protecting the concept of academic freedom ourselves, because much is at stake if we hand ammunition to those who want to undermine it. Political attacks on science erode public trust. A telling example comes again from the United States. A year before Trump's first election in 2016, 54% of American Republicans believed colleges and universities had a positive impact on the country, 54%. A year later, that number had dropped to 36%. So what happens in politics, what words are used and how often they are repeated matters for trust in science. And going back to our own country, although many of the doomsday scenarios surrounding the Schoof cabinet may not have come true, the danger to free science has definitely not disappeared. We must strengthen ourselves against political interference on our campuses and defend academic freedom and research integrity. This is an urgent responsibility for us as a university sector, because in the Netherlands, we're almost unique in the degree of self-regulation of our scientific system. And scientific integrity is a fine example of this. We have a nationwide code of conduct for scientific integrity that we ourselves own. We have professional through procedures to investigate and assess alleged breaches of integrity, guided by our own people, many of whom are here today. Crucially, it is a self-learning system. When our procedures or standards no longer meet social or scientific expectations, we adapt. For example, consider the recent debate about transparency in ancillary activities. Following those discussions, we appointed a commission of field experts to assess whether the 2018 code still reflected current realities. Based on their recommendation, a drafting committee is now revising the code. But we also must look ourselves in the mirror, because to be fair, we are sometimes slow and we're sometimes a bit stubborn. Professors' outside activities only became fully and easily accessible online after several media outlets had reported shortcomings. Maybe it would have been better if we had acted sooner and more adequately on that. This is part of the and the reason for it is that that's part of the decentral organization of our universities that we also cherish. No one is truly the boss in our university landscape. And that brings great freedom and creativity, but it also can clash with today's political climate and sometimes with what society expects from us. Another example of self-regulation is the internationalization plans universities presented this spring. Acting within our self-governing role, we made binding agreements to convert some bachelor programs from English back to Dutch and to mitigate the negative effects of internationalization while preserving its benefits. Because as publicly funded institutions with a major societal responsibilities, universities must listen to what's happening in society. Public funding requires at least a minimum level of political and societal support for our work. Because, and not very many people know this, at least I think, because many people have asked me about it. Almost all political parties, from the right to the left and everybody in between, have called for action on internationalization. If you look at the election manifestos of 2 years ago, it was really across the political board that everybody wanted something to be done about the enormous influx of international students. So at such a moment, universities cannot simply bury their heads in the sand. We exist for society. We claim that we help society move forward. So criticism from society, especially when so widely shared, is a legitimate mirror that we must look into. Arguments, of course, must be weighed, and a reasonable, responsible response is appropriate. But refusing to do so only breeds greater misunderstanding and political pressure. If we hadn't acted, the TAO, the foreign language test, would have soon applied to over 210 bachelor's programs, almost half of our programs, under criteria that the minister would have been able to change at will as we would go along. And before the summer, a large majority, more than 2/3 majority in Parliament, chose the university's plan over that test. Former Minister Bruin supported that choice, and a revised bill is now in preparation. Now, that space would never have been granted had we arrogantly dismissed public sentiment. Who knows what might then have happened to our English-taught master's programs? But there are still weaknesses in our system. In many countries, academic freedom is legally protected. In the Netherlands, it isn't. And we now rank near the bottom of Europe when it comes to legal protection of academic freedom. In neighboring countries, it is enshrined in the constitution even. The KNW at the moment has therefore started a debate on whether academic freedom should be given stronger legal protection. And this is also a tricky matter because on the one hand, it sounds very attractive. Yes, protect our academic freedom legally or even constitutionally. On the other hand, this is tricky because of the timing, right? If you want to codify in law academic freedom, is the current political climate the ideal group of people, the current composition of Parliament, the ideal group of people to ask to make such a law? But the KNW is working on that, and we're expecting an advice from them in the course of next year. Whether by law or by constitution or at all, one thing will always hold true. Academic freedom, as much as we cherish it, is never absolute. It constantly demands responsibility towards students, towards colleagues, politics, society, and science itself. We must foster a culture in which differing views are sought out, are shared and questioned in a respectful and evidence-based manner. We are collectively responsible for the quality and integrity of science and for our professionalism as scientific organizations. Society must be able to trust that. So these things bring me to two broader challenges. First, it is our connection to the wider society. As I mentioned, perceptions of internationalization in society differ widely. Some see it as contributing to housing shortages and annoying English on cafe terraces. Others see it as an economic driver, a source of cultural enrichment, and a wellspring of much-needed talent. And both can be true at the same time. How you judge it likely depends on your background, your experiences, and your place in society. Recently, our colleague, Professor Mark Bovens, delivered his farewell lecture, and the core of his message was this: education has become the new pillarization. People increasingly marry, work, vote, play sports, and live with others of the same educational level. and that shapes universities' position in society. What we in our community see as normal or as the public interest is not automatically the same for most other citizens. That deserves ongoing attention. Bovens offered valuable suggestions, including for research practice, so that we do not become an island within society. It also concerns how we defend our institutions when accusations are unfounded. We are often seen as arrogant, and at times that is justified, but I also see a sector so eager to serve that it sometimes compromises on its own values. Too often we quietly accept the suggestion that universities only accommodate left progressive perspectives. Of course, incidents occur and we must stay alert to ensure an open culture, but the daily reality at Dutch universities is a diverse environment where a wide range of perspectives meet and challenge each other. A personal example, in my classes at the University of Groningen, I used to invite Jenny Douwes, who was at the time a leading figure in the pro-Black Pete movement. And this was, she was from the north, and she was in the press, and well, I kind of knew what most of my students were thinking about the topic, but if we would just discuss that among ourselves, I also knew that there wouldn't be much challenging of ideas. So we contacted her, and she was very willing to come, and she told basically her life story, what is her outlook on life, and also how that kind of culminated in her actions with that highway blockade that happened a couple of years ago. Now, this was not a very smooth discussion. It was a very sharp discussion, but it was a discussion that took place within an academic context and that everybody found normal, because also other perspectives are welcome at the university as long as they happen in a sort of controlled academic context where learning and exchange is put at the core of what we are doing. I think also of here at Leiden, of course, Afshin Elian, Ad Verbrugge at the Free University, or Albert Dijkgraaf at Erasmus University. These are people who don't represent a left-wing progressive perspective, and they are no exceptions. They are respected colleagues, prominent conservative scholars whose voices are clearly heard both inside and outside the university. Even if these people are not the exceptions, does that mean that universities perfectly mirror the political preferences of the Netherlands? Of course they don't. And to be fair, I don't even think they should. Think of other sectors, right? The same is true for journalists. Many journalists vote progressive, yet that doesn't limit the freedom of outlets such as Elsevier's Weekblad or De Telegraaf or SBS to do their work according to the professional norms of journalism. And I think it's the same in our sector. It's not about your political color, but it's about our professional standards and our academic freedom. I think, and I wrote something about this in yesterday's edition of the Telegraaf, which I think all of you know is not the most progressive media outlet you could find in the Netherlands, but I think that's exactly then the type of audience that we should seek out, because I think that universities too often take on board everything that is shouted towards them from the sidelines. They should take, in my view, a firmer stance in the public debate and stand for what they do. At the same time, the internal conversation about where that open culture does fall short starts, in my view, sometimes too late and moves too slowly. And I think we need to change that. The aim of my piece in the Telegraaf yesterday morning was to open up that conversation. And judging by the many reactions that I got, that opening up seems to be working well. So we can build on that in the following weeks and months. Now, coming back to the question that I started with, all of these things that we are doing and all of these conversations that we're starting, does it make us safe from a Huxley scenario? Again, after all these considerations, my answer still would be, I don't know. As I said in the beginning, anyone watching our colleagues in the US at the moment will feel a chill. Things can deteriorate quickly, we learn from the American case, not only for institutions, but also for individual researchers. But political favor and public authority are two different things. It is no coincidence that universities have existed in the Netherlands for almost half a millennium. And if there's one takeaway that I also want to give it is that I think that with our backs straight and our gaze outward, we can keep our great institutions at the top of the world and at the heart of society. Thank you.